Prague is the only great capital in Central Europe that still looks more or less the way it did before the 20th century got hold of it. Gothic spires, baroque fronts, a medieval square with real cobbles under your feet. This is its whole life, from a gravel crossing on a river nobody outside Bohemia had heard of, to the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, and on to the city that twice rearranged European history by opening a window. The remarkable part is not how beautiful it became. It is what it walked through to stay that way. The river came first. The Vltava, say it Vltava, swings a wide loop through a basin of soft rock, and at one point in that loop, the water thins out over gravel. You could get a cart across. In a country of forest and hills, that is not a small thing. Somewhere in the 4th century before Christ, Celtic people we call the Boii were smelting iron in this basin, and they left behind the country's oldest name, Bohemia, the home of the Boii, Bohemia. 23 centuries later, we are still using their word. Germanic groups drifted through. In the 6th century after Christ, Slavic settlers came from the east and stayed. They built in timber, they buried their people under low mounds, and they took the two heights above that crossing, a spur on the left bank, a rock on the right, because from up there you could see exactly who was coming down the valley. The Czech founding story belongs here, and it is a story, not a record. A wise woman called Libuše, is said to have stood on the rock at Vyšehrad, looked north over the water, and spoken of a city whose glory would touch the stars. She sent her men to fetch a ploughman named Přemyslid to be her husband, and from that pair came the dynasty that genuinely did rule Bohemia for 4 centuries. The chronicler who first wrote it down was working roughly 300 years after the fact. Make of that what you will. What we can date is the castle. Around 880, a Přemyslid prince named Bořivoj, shifted his seat onto that left bank spur and raised a small church on it. He had been baptized, tradition says by Methodius himself, which made him the first Christian ruler of the Czechs, and far more usefully, made him a man the German bishops had to negotiate with rather than convert. That spur is Prague Castle. Power has sat on it, unbroken, for 1100 years. It is still, by area, the largest coherent castle complex on Earth. His grandson is the one half the world sings about every December. Wenceslas, took the ducal throne as a young man in the 920s, with Saxon armies pressing from the west and his own nobles unsettled at home. He paid tribute rather than fight. He built a rotunda on the castle spur to house the relic of St. Vitus. On a cold morning in 935, walking to church at Stara Boleslav, he was set upon by his brother's men and never reached the door. He was not a king, by the way. The crown was granted to him long after he was gone, and the carol was written in 1853 by an English clergyman, John Mason Neale, who set his words to a 13th century spring dance tune. The real man's real achievement was buying his small country out of a war it could not win. To me, that is nerve, not weakness, though plenty of chroniclers went the other way. If you're with me, the like button is where you plant your flag. If you think he should have fought, go and take me apart underneath. By the 10th century, the slope between castle and river had become a market, and word of it had travelled a very long way. Around 965, a Jewish merchant and diplomat from Muslim Spain, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, passed through and wrote the earliest surviving outside description of the place. He noted that it was built of stone and lime, that traders came in from Krakow and from the lands of the Turks, and that for trade it was the richest town he had seen in those parts. A traveller from Córdoba, standing in the mud of Central Europe, deciding this was somewhere worth writing down. A bishopric followed in 973, and with it came books, Latin, and a reason for scholars to stay. The rock across the water, Vyšehrad, had its own moment as a royal seat in the 11th century. But the pull of the crossing always won. Stone arrived on the river in the 1150s, when Vladislav II ordered a bridge and named it for his wife, Judith. It went up over 14 years, and it was only the second stone bridge in all of Central Europe. Merchants paid a toll at the tower and complained about it, which is possibly the most human continuity in this entire story. For 170 years, everything crossing Bohemia crossed there. In February 1342, after a hard freeze and a fast thaw, the ice came down the Vltava in slabs. The Judith Bridge broke apart and went with it. Parts of it are still down there in the cellars of Malá Strana, and you can go and look at them. The dynasty had already broken before the bridge did. The last Přemyslid king was lost in Olomouc in 1306 at 17, and the male line ended with him, 4 centuries finished in an afternoon. The crown passed by marriage to the House of Luxembourg, whose first Bohemian king spent most of his reign abroad and eventually fell in France, blind, at Crécy. His son had been born in Prague in 1316, taken to the French court as a child, and christened Wenceslas. He came back speaking 4 languages and calling himself Charles. What Charles IV did to this city in 30 years is almost unfair. He became King of Bohemia in 1346 and Holy Roman Emperor 9 years after that, which meant the imperial capital was suddenly here, on the Vltava. In 1348 alone, he founded a university, the first in Central Europe, still running, still bearing his name, and laid out an entirely new town on the fields east of the walls, 360 hectares. It tripled the size of Prague overnight, and it was so generously planned that his horse market is now Wenceslas Square, and his cattle market is still one of the largest public spaces in Europe. He was rebuilding the cathedral too, and when his first architect was lost, the job went to a 23-year-old from Swabia called Peter Parler. Parler had no business being trusted with it. He gave the choir a vault of interlocking ribs that nobody in Europe had attempted before, and stonemasons came from all over the continent to work out how he had done it. Sit with that for a second. The man was younger than most of my students. Charles collected relics the way other rulers collected land. He wrote his own autobiography, and in 1360 he put the poor to work building a wall up Petřín Hill during a bad harvest, which is why Praguers still call it the Hunger Wall. And in 1357, at the old crossing, he began a new bridge to replace the broken one. 16 arches, 516 meters. The guides will tell you the foundation stone was laid at a numerologically perfect moment, and they will tell you the mortar was mixed with eggs sent in from every village in Bohemia. The first is a lovely modern invention. The second has been chemically tested more than once, and no one has ever found a trace of egg. I'd almost prefer the eggs. Prague, at his end, held maybe 40,000 people and was one of the largest cities in Europe. In 1410, the town councillors commissioned an astronomical clock for the old town hall that showed the sun, the moon, and the old Bohemian hours all at once. It still works. It is the oldest astronomical clock on Earth, still ticking with its original mechanism, and the crowd that gathers under it at noon is doing precisely what a crowd did there 600 years ago. Something less comfortable was building in the pulpits. From 1402, a preacher named Jan Hus was speaking at the Bethlehem Chapel in Czech, not Latin, to congregations of 3,000, and what he said about wealth in the church was popular in exactly the way that gets a man summoned. He went to the Council of Constance in 1415 with a promise of safe conduct. he did not leave it. Prague heard the news and did not forgive it. On the 30th of July, 1419, a crowd came to the new town hall demanding the release of prisoners, and the councillors went out through the upstairs windows. The word for that, defenestration, is one this city effectively gave to the world, and it is not finished with it yet. What followed was 15 years of war that nobody expected the Czechs to survive. 4 papal crusades came at Bohemia. All 4 failed. The commander who broke the first of them on Witkov Hill in 1420, Jan Hus, had sight in one eye, then in none, and never lost a battle either way. He fought with farm flails and wagons chained into moving fortresses, and there is now an enormous bronze horseman on that hill in his memory, one of the biggest equestrian statues anywhere. For a while, Prague did something extraordinary and quiet. It lived with 2 churches. In 1458, the estates elected George of Podobrady, a Hussite, as king, and 6 years later he sent envoys around Europe proposing a permanent league of Christian rulers with a common assembly to settle disputes without fighting. Nobody took it seriously. 500 years early is still early. The Habsburgs took the Bohemian crown in 1526 and mostly ruled from Vienna, and Prague settled into being a provincial capital with imperial memories. Fire took much of the castle and the little quarter beneath it in 1541. The rebuild is why so much of that hillside is Renaissance. Everything changed again because one emperor could not stand Vienna. In 1583, Rudolf II moved his entire court here, and for a generation, Prague was the strangest capital in Europe. He filled the castle with clocks, narwhal horns, and mechanical toys. He funded astronomers, and in 1600, a young German mathematician named Johannes Kepler arrived to work with the Danish observer Tycho Brahe, a man who had lost part of his nose in a student duel and wore a metal replacement for the rest of his life. Brahe was gone within 18 months. Kepler inherited his observations of Mars, and out of Prague came the discovery that planets travel in ellipses, not circles. The building where he lived is still on Karlova Street, with people walking past it eating ice cream. The city's Jewish quarter reached its own high point in these years under the scholar Judah Lew ben Bezalel, the Maharal, whose grave is one of the most visited stones in the old Jewish cemetery, and around whose name the legend of the Golem, the clay guardian of the quarter, gathered much later. Rudolf's tolerance did not outlive him by long. On the 23rd of May, 1618, Protestant nobles climbed to a room in the castle, argued with 2 imperial governors, and put them out of the window, 70 feet. All 3 men, the governors and their secretary, got up and walked away. Catholic writers said angels caught them. Protestant writers said they landed in a heap of manure below the wall. The secretary's name was Philip Fabricius, and here is the detail I cannot get over. The emperor later ennobled him, and the title he received translates as of high fall. A man made a baron for surviving a drop into a dung heap. I have tried for years to imagine what he had engraved on the family crest, and I have never got there. If you can do better, I want to read it below. That window started the 30 Years' War. On the 8th of November, 1620, the Bohemian army met the imperial force at White Mountain on the western edge of the city. The fighting lasted about 2 hours. Their new king, Frederick, had been on the throne one winter, fled before the day was out, and is remembered by that fact alone, the Winter King. On the 21st of June the following year, 27 leaders of the revolt were lost on the old town square. There are 27 crosses set into the paving there now. Tourists stand on them without noticing, and I have never once managed to walk over them. What came next emptied the country. Protestant families were given the choice of conversion or exile, and tens of thousands chose the road. Among them was a teacher called Jan Amos Komensky. Comenius, who left in 1628, never came home and spent his exile inventing something quietly revolutionary. Schooling designed around how children actually learn, including the first picture textbook in European history. He is on the Czech 200-crown note. Most people outside this country have never heard his name. In 1648, a Swedish army seized the castle and the whole left bank, and the last thing standing between them and the old town was the bridge. It was held by townspeople, Jewish residents, and a scratch company of university students for weeks, until word came that the war was over. The Swedes left with the best of Rudolf's collection, including a manuscript so large it takes 2 people to lift, which sits in Stockholm to this day. Bohemia had lost perhaps a third of its people. Prague went from around 60,000 to roughly 20. A ruined city with money behind it becomes a baroque one. Through the next century, the burned quarters filled with domes, palaces, and painted ceilings, and in 1784, the Emperor Joseph II finally stitched the 4 separate towns into one municipality called Prague. 3 years after that, on an October evening in 1787, a 31-year-old composer stood in the pit of the estate's theatre and conducted the first performance of Don Giovanni, written for this city because Vienna had cooled on him. He is said to have remarked that his Praguers understood him. That theatre is still there. It still sells tickets. German was the language of the offices and the university. Czech was the language of the kitchens and the villages. In the early 19th century, a generation of scholars set out to change that, compiling dictionaries and histories almost from scratch, and the movement they started turned into something no empire quite knew how to handle. Its monument is the National Theatre, paid for by public subscription, opened in 1881 and gutted by fire 11 weeks later. Collections restarted within days. Ordinary people gave again. It reopened in 1883 with 2 words carved above the stage that translate as "the nation to itself." Railways arrived, factories went up in the suburbs, and the population passed 500,000. Then, from 1893, the city did something it can never take back. In the name of sanitation, it demolished nearly all of the old Jewish quarter, Josefov, and replaced its lanes with grand apartment blocks. 6 synagogues, a town hall, and the cemetery survived. That cemetery had been the community's only burial ground for 300 years, so graves were laid over graves up to 12 layers deep, and about 12,000 stones now lean into each other on a plot the size of a small park. It is the quietest place in Prague. A clerk at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute walked past that quarter's demolition on his way to work. Franz Kafka wrote at night in German in a city that was fast becoming Czech, and he asked a friend in a letter whether they might ever escape a place like this. A little mother, he called it, with claws. The empire came apart in 1918, and on the 28th of October, the crowds on Wenceslas Square heard that Czechoslovakia existed. Prague was a capital again after 300 years. It boomed. Functionalist architecture, cinemas, one of the most literate populations in Europe. It lasted 20 years. German troops came through the snow into the castle in March 1939. The war that followed left the buildings mostly standing and the city hollowed out. On the walls of the Pinkas synagogue today, there are 77,297 names, hand-lettered, floor to ceiling, of Jewish people from Bohemia and Moravia who did not come back. It takes a long time to walk those rooms. It should. In February 1945, an American formation navigating in cloud mistook Prague for Dresden. and around 700 people were lost in an afternoon. In May, the city rose, fought behind its own barricades, and in the fighting, the old town hall burned, and the astronomical clock was very nearly finished for good. It was rebuilt by hand and started again in 1948. The same year, a communist government took power and closed the country for 4 decades. The thaw, when it came fast. In 1968, a reform leadership under Alexander Dubček lifted censorship and promised what they called socialism with a human face, and for 8 months, Prague was the most hopeful city on the continent. Warsaw-packed tanks ended it on the 21st of August. A student named Jan Hus made a protest in January 1969 that this city has never been able to put down. There is a small bronze marker at the top of Wenceslas Square, and people still leave flowers on it. 20 years of grey followed, and a playwright who kept writing anyway. On the 17th of November 1989, a student march was broken up on Národní Street. Within days, the squares were full. Within a fortnight, there were hundreds of thousands on Letná Plain, shaking keys in the air, the sound of ringing a government out. There was no fighting. By the 29th of December, Václav Havel was president, and the historic centre went onto the UNESCO list 3 years later. Czechoslovakia divided peacefully in 1993, and Prague woke up as the capital of the Czech Republic. In August 2002, the Vltava rose to a level not seen for 5 centuries, flooded 18 metro stations, and forced the evacuation of the zoo, where a sea lion called Gaston made his own arrangements and was recovered 250 kilometers downstream, near Dresden, having presumably decided the whole thing was an opportunity. Today, about 1.3 million people live here, and something like 8 million come to look. The statues on the bridge are copies. The originals are indoors, out of the weather. The trams still grind up to the castle, and at 6 in the morning, before the crowds, you can stand at the middle of that crossing, with the mist coming off the water, and hear nothing but gulls. The same gravel shallows the Boii forded under 16 arches that have held for 650 years. I'm Edward, and this is what I do here. Pull cities back out of the dark and let them talk. If you'd like to keep walking centuries with me, subscribing costs you nothing and means a great deal. And tell me below what stayed with you from this one. The window, the bridge, the names on that wall, and which city you want me to bring back to life next. I read them. Empires came for the crossing. Kings, emperors, armies, ideologies, all of them wanted the ford, and all of them are gone. The river bends, the bridge holds, and Prague, stubborn and standing, goes on being Prague.